Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Andrew Cooper. I'm one of the directors of the Conservative Political Action Network, which does run the, you may have heard of it, the CPAC conference in Australia. And conservative is a funny word. It means a lot of things to different people. What does it mean to us? Well, here at CPAC, we think conservatism is the political principle that sovereignty resides in the person. And what does that mean? That means that you should be in control of your life, your work, how you want to craft, how your family lives. That should reside with you. It shouldn't be in the control of government, nor anyone else for that matter. It's up to you. And if we want to summarise that, it's really a classical liberal principle, a classical liberal value, something that I think really is within the soul of this nation, within the soul of all of us, notwithstanding the fact that we go a little pear-shaped every now and then. Our country was built on this principle, and whenever we do struggle, it's because we stray from this. What we get out of life is up to each of us, not the government. Politically, who does CPAC support? We don't support political parties, but we do support those that are aligned with these true liberal values. In the last 6 months, we've held events with Senator Amanda Stoker of the Liberal Party, Senator Matthew Canavan of the National Party, Jacinta Price of the Northern Territory Country Liberal Party. They're all up for election in the next federal election, along with our Speaker. In the past, we've had speakers such as Nigel Farage of the Brexit Party, Mark Meadows, leader of the Republican Party in the US, people like, we've had One Nation speakers, we've had United Australia speakers, UAP speakers. We are a party that supports, we are an organisation that supports conservative values, and it doesn't matter what party you're with, we will support the people that support those classical, liberal, deeply held, deeply admired conservative values that I know you admire as well. And now we have another speaker from the Liberal Democrats. He's switched parties, but there's no doubt, in my mind at least, he's a classical liberal that believes in you. That sovereignty and control should be vested in you and not by the state. And he has a question to put to you. Who are the real liberals? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Campbell Newman.
Thanks very much, Coops. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I acknowledge Coops and his fellow directors, but can I also just acknowledge the Lib Dem's candidates that are here this evening. Can't miss any opportunity to acknowledge people you're running with. So Tegan Granger, my Senate running mate, Toby Sutherland, who's running for Ford, Alex Forbes, who's running for Fadden, Jens Lippener for Longman, and Damien Curry, who's running for the seat of Ryan. And I hope someone else hasn't snuck in. I always used to say to my councillors, come and see me before I speak so I get you on the list. But ladies and gentlemen, it is great to be here this evening because CPAC is non-partisan, non-aligned, but it's all about promoting conservatism in an era where it's sort of a bit out of fashion, or it has been. I was once doing a show on Sky News with Peter Beattie, and one evening we were driving back from Macquarie Park in a taxi to Sydney Airport after doing the show, and Peter and I really got into this philosophical discussion, and Pete said, you know what, Campbell, back in my younger days, it was we in the left that had a hard time getting our message out. But today it's your mob. And it's so true. And that was about 6 years ago. I've never forgotten it. So thank you, CPAC. What you're doing, Coops, with your board is just so critically important. Tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take you on a journey exploring the topic of who are the real Liberals. We're going to firstly look at the state of the party that legislated themselves last year, a monopoly on that name. I'm then going to turn to examine the impact of COVID and where our national psyche has got to in 2022 before making some rather brutal observations about the public sector. And with this all in mind, I'm then going to pull things together and make some clear points about what I think real Liberals actually should stand for. Now, the publication of the fifth intergenerational report back in 2021 painted a fairly bleak outlook for Australia's economic future. And I say right now, this is a bit of a trigger warning, I'm actually a half full sort of person, and I always try and look at things about how you can turn something around, but that fifth intergenerational report has some really worrying stuff in it. Its release in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic meant it very, very quickly disappeared from the news cycle. And that was unfortunate because of the sobering projections that it contained. A scenario of lower growth, higher government spending, ongoing deficits, increased government debt and slower population growth should have been cause for significant public debate. At that time, the economy was forecast to grow more slowly, with growth at 2.6% per annum over the next 40 years compared to 3% over the previous 4 decades. And I do seem to recall a former Labor Treasurer, was it Paul Keating, I think, who said if we can't get 4% growth, that was back in the 80s, you know, we're lost, it was words to that effect. So where did we get to accepting 2.6? Anyway, this may have changed, or the projections in the intergenerational report may have changed a bit for the moment due to the COVID-19 mini-boom engendered by massive monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine with its impact on commodity prices. But the lower economic growth rates in that report don't have to be accepted. I refuse to accept sluggish, ongoing growth. That does not have to be the scenario for this country going forward. Nevertheless, for the realists out there, the message is clear that the next generation of Australians will be dealing with lower incomes and living standards and potentially higher taxes and reduced services if we don't do something. Clearly, this is a major challenge for our political leaders and their parties, but if the past 15 years are any guide, it currently seems unlikely that they will rise to the reform challenge. During the pandemic, the move to big government and economic intervention has accelerated. Rather than adopt a mantra of personal responsibility and resilience, the message has been that government has all the answers. And the response from a coalition federal government has particularly eroded its traditional strength as the home of small government, balanced budgets, lower government spending and low debt. Sadly, I'm convinced that the past 2 years have fundamentally damaged the Liberal Party and its long-term credibility. However, sadly, I'm also of the view that the white ants had already been infesting the structure well before the pandemic. For 2 decades, despite positive wins at federal and state level, there's been a drift from the Liberal and National parties to minor parties and independents. The primary vote, which you should always focus on, not the 2PP, has been going down and down. And what we're seeing more recently will continue to demonstrate that decline. Added to that is the decline in party membership and the ageing demographic of the party. Now, I reflect that the Labor Party faces its own challenges, but this address isn't about them, of course. But I do note that Paul Keating in 2016 lamented through, I think, the pages of The Australian, that the ALP had failed to capture the votes of the middle class that had benefited from the reforms instituted during the 1980s and the early 1990s. He knew He knows that Labor needs to win votes. Are you watching, Albo? He knows that you have to win votes in the centre ground of politics in this country, the aspirational middle class. But the Labor Party have not been able to develop a policy agenda that can appeal to them. At face value, some consider this to be all bad news for the ALP and good news for the coalition. However, a more strategic look at what has been happening in Australia and other Western nations is offered by Thomas Piketty, I think is how you pronounce it, the French economist. Essentially, he has pointed to a strong trend for the highly educated in the community to support the centre-left, with those without tertiary qualifications voting for centre-right parties. Older, well-educated progressives vote for the ALP, while young inner-city professionals have gravitated to the Greens. The numbers are stark. Only 15% of the 18 to 24 age group and only 27% of the 25 to 34 age group vote for the coalition. In contrast, 55% of the 65 plus demographic support the coalition. It's therefore time to recognise that the Liberal Party is facing a crisis with its support base evaporating, and it's particularly worrying that the young in the community have abandoned the party in droves. And it doesn't have to be that way. Now, I believe that the problem has arisen for the following key reasons. Firstly, and firmly, and furiously, and Daisy might want to ask me a question later on, a failure to be true to the stated values of the party and to explain and defend those values. The dominance of the left within the primary, secondary and tertiary components of the education system and its impact on young people. The rise and dominance of the professional political class that are ex-political staffers or employees of peak representative bodies, people who don't come from a true business background. And finally, and this might surprise some people, the introduction of public election funding, which has reduced the need for parties and politicians to fundraise and therefore engage with and listen to small business. Now, it's not good enough, ladies and gentlemen, to say that you're better than the Labor Party. That's not a compelling pitch for electoral success, and it breeds cynicism and resentment amongst those who could genuinely be won over. I believe it's this that has led to the fragmentation of the centre-right vote and the drift away from the Liberal and National parties. To define true blue liberalism, what we're here to do tonight, it's helpful to reach back to the words of Sir Robert Menzies. In his iconic Forgotten People address of 22nd of May 1942, he says some things that 80 years on, almost to the month, still speak with incredible resonance. Firstly, he defines the middle class, the people he was going after, as, quote, the kind of people I myself represent in Parliament, salary earners, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, professional men and women, farmers and so on. And then he makes the point that they're taken for granted by each political party in turn, and yet they're the backbone of the nation. He warned, and I quote, that the great vice of democracy, a vice which is exacting a bitter retribution, is that, think about Australia today, is that for a generation we have been busy getting ourselves onto the list of beneficiaries and removing ourselves from the list of contributors, as if somewhere there was somebody else's wealth and somebody else's effort on which we could thrive. And in a comment that is remarkably prescient considering the response to COVID-19, try this one, quote, under the pressures of war we may, remember it was 1942, if we are not careful, if we are not as thoughtful as the times will permit us to be, inflict a fatal injury on our own backbone. Think COVID. And most importantly, and my late mother loved this bit, she quoted it quite a bit, if the new world is to be a world of men, we must not be pallid and bloodless ghosts, but a community of people whose motto shall be to strive, to seek, to find and not to yield, Individual enterprise must drive us forward. Based on the expression of these values by Menzies and reflecting on what has been happening, I can't help but come to the conclusion that imposters have taken over the Liberal Party. I'm talking about the politicians, I'm not talking about the rank and file. They mouth platitudes about their support for the aspirational voters and private enterprise, but when in government, they simply don't deliver. In short, particularly for small business, they've taken them, us, me, for granted. Anyway, don't just take my word for it. Bill Lang from Small Business Australia said as much on Sky News on the 1st of July last year. True blue Liberals, ladies and gentlemen, stand for liberty, freedom, self-reliance, reward for hard work, small and efficient government, balanced budgets, low debt, and an acute appreciation that every single dollar spent has come out of the hide of a hard-working Australian. And I challenge anybody to really say that last week's federal budget delivered on that sort of ethos. I now want to go off on a bit of a tangent, but it'll all probably make sense in the end, I hope, and talk about the impact of the last 2 years. If you had asked people about their view of the Australian national psyche back in 2019, they would probably have responded with some of the traditional perspectives. Larrikins, self-reliant, irreverent, healthy disrespect for authority and politicians, help each other and look after their mates. However, after the tumultuous events of the past 2 years, the moment has come for a reality check where we must stop and reflect on what has happened and what we have become. It's time to face the sobering reality that the era of COVID-19 confronts us with harsh facts about who we really are now. 2 years of government by diktat would suggest some new descriptions of the nation. Risk-averse, conformists, infantilised and reliant on government, dobbers, selfish, compliant, subservient, manipulated. Many would object to the above generalisations, but if we are to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves, we're not the country we thought we were 3 years ago. Who would have thought that we'd be prepared to sit back meekly while borders were shut and families were kept apart? That passports could have one use, which was to obtain a MyGov account. The check-in apps became ubiquitous. Most disappointing is the far too widespread acceptance that people should be denied employment or excluded from full participation in society, hence the venue tonight, on the basis that they refuse to take essentially an experimental or early stage medical treatment. However, on reflection, ladies and gentlemen, the rot had set in some time ago. It's just that coronavirus has brought these matters to a head. Why did this happen? Well, our country is blessed with incredible natural riches. The wealth that has flowed from our exports of iron ore, gas, coal and agricultural products has given us an enviable standard of living, an extraordinary, and this is the point, extraordinarily generous social security system. And unfortunately, this has meant as well, given the business environment, that the culture of our large corporate businesses has been more about governance and risk management than about an entrepreneurial and growth culture. To impose vaccine mandates on one's workforce is then just an extension of the workplace health and safety system and concepts of zero harm. Meantime, the bounty of the export riches and rivers of gold flowing to government have permitted the largesse of the welfare system and inexorably encouraged a culture of dependency. Australians have come to believe that not only does government have all the money, but it's got all the answers. If government is closing the border, restricting movement, requiring masks and undertaking widespread surveillance and keeping us safe, it's accepted and almost totally unchallenged by the mainstream. The education system is another factor adding to the national malaise and the acceptance of COVID coercion. 20 to 30 years of an activist-inspired curriculum with lashings of climate change alarmism, a lack of history and instruction on the law and our system of government has been corrosive to our national pride, faith in our institutions, but perversely has led to acceptance of the loss of freedom. Now, the young in our community are terrific people, but they're hamstrung by an education system, in my view, that has failed to properly give them the goods as citizens in a highly competitive, and we now know dangerous world. For my part, the most worrying feature is the conformism that has been pounded into them and a breathtaking lack of perspective about politics, government, the law and the economy. I now turn to some observations on the public sector. Once upon a time, the most lucrative financial rewards in the economy were to be found in the private sector. Perhaps they still are at the top end of town. However, over the past 20 years, the data shows that for many in the public service at federal, state and local government level, pay packets have outstripped those of business employees. Whilst private sector pay has been constrained to the CPI or even less, public servants have regularly, for 20 years, enjoyed greater than CPI pay increases. And over time, a significant gap has been opened up. Former staffers of mine that still work in the public sector would never come and work for me in my business. I simply couldn't afford them. They're on incredibly high wages. At the top of the public service bureaucracies, the most senior people are now paid well in excess of their political masters. Departmental secretaries are paid more than premiers, and their ministers and CEOs paid vastly more than their elected mayors. Now, whilst employment law in this country has continued to strengthen rights for all employees, permanent employees, there is no doubt that the public service continues to enjoy superior job security. So, higher pay and superior job security. One would hope, therefore, that we had the most efficient, effective and customer-focused organisations dedicated to serving us all. What, sniggers? Sadly, this is not the case. Bloated bureaucracies, poorly administering programs such as vaccine rollouts. Prime Minister, it wasn't a great moment. Sorry, if you're watching, it wasn't. And for the media who gave them away through, it was a ramshackle shower of the proverbial. Anyway, I had to get that in. Installation of pink bats, thank you Kevin Rudd, solar panel and water tank incentive schemes. I've been there in local government. Major infrastructure projects that see costs blow out by 30 to 40%, hospitals with ambulance ramping and unacceptable surgery waiting times. And let's not forget what we saw in Victoria via the Coate inquiry. My point being, where no one seems to be held accountable for critical decisions. No one's in charge. Ladies and gentlemen, my view has always been that more money is not the answer. The answer is actually better management. Why as a community do we not demand better performance from these organisations that are there to actually serve us? And finally, while it's right and proper that politicians walk the plank, not that a lot of that's going on lately, isn't it time that senior public servants were held accountable, and they went as well when things went awry. True Liberals believe in smaller government, but true Liberals would also say that it would be a great start to make what we've currently got actually perform. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're on the downhill ride now. It's okay. We could get back to a few drinks and some questions. But I'm going to pull all that together now with just my shopping list of what real Liberals believe. If that's the environment, those are the big challenges, these are the matters that must be addressed, what would the true Liberals do right now? So first one, won't surprise you, be fierce, consistent advocates for private enterprise. Create a comprehensive national framework for the establishment and operation of small business. Reverse the insidious erosion of the protection afforded by the corporate veil and the imposition of criminal liability on directors. Why do people think companies were thought of in the first place? And we're taking away every reason for their existence. Reduce the corporate tax rate to 20%. Thank you, Mr. President. Brownie points, getting that in. Get regulators such as the ATO and ASIC under control by putting in place supervisory boards with significant small business representation. How controversial is that? Legislate to ensure that the primary objective of the national electricity market is to deliver low-cost, reliable power benchmarked against our best international competitors. Remove the ban on nuclear power. Amend the Federal Environment Act so that it ensures the environment is protected, but it also makes sure that projects can achieve approvals within reasonable timeframes. For Steve Baxter, allow cash-strapped start-up firms to issue shares in lieu of cash that are totally exempt from tax until they're actually sold. Reform employment law to make it easy and straightforward to employ people under flexible agreements that work for employer and employee and enable people to be safely terminated for misconduct or non-performance. I digress from that. Our daughter lives in London. She and her husband run a business. I'm just amazed by how much easier it is in the UK to actually employ, or if you need to terminate someone. We are just living in la-la land. Ensure public service pay increases are not out of step with the private sector. End government funding of elections. Second, we're not getting any at the moment. Second main thought, give Australians back their money to manage and encourage self-reliance and personal responsibility. Yeah. So you remove the transfer payments that come in to Middle Australia, but implement a tax-free threshold of $40,000 and a flat personal tax rate of 20%, and make superannuation voluntary. Thirdly, support bold policy initiatives. Now this is Campbell Newman freelancing now, Lib Dems. This isn't actually in the Freedom Manifesto. I hope the President and the State President will not have too many problems with this. But anyway, we'll move on. Support bold policy initiatives to encourage and facilitate home ownership for all Australians. 1, remove all government tax imposts on the purchase of the family home for genuine first home buyers. Work with banks and legislate the creation of special savings accounts that will be exempt for tax if saving for the deposit for a first home, to encourage and teach saving, which is something that we don't have anymore. Require councils to expedite planning approvals for high-rise apartments and broad-acre land subdivisions, tie council financial assistance grants to performance. Financially support the creation of new public housing, but channeling Margaret Thatcher, put in place a mechanism to assist public housing tenants to ultimately purchase the property. Fourth area, fight for liberal education and parental choice. Eliminate the odious national curriculum. Provide funding to the family, in other words, vouchers, and allow parents and children to decide where they're going, so choice. Promote that the education system, so this is about advocacy by politicians, that the education system should be about this: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and educates people about our institutions and form of government. And let's leave the rest to parents. Make political advocacy or activity within schools by teachers and school staff illegal. That's one of my personal ones. Fifth one, and the final one, and then we're almost there. Be defenders of liberty, free speech, racial and religious equality. So firstly, and this is a big one from our Freedom Manifesto, amend the Australian Constitution to protect free speech with an amendment shamelessly plagiarised from the US Constitution. It's worked for them, it can work for us. Defund the ABC, So no wonder I haven't been invited on Steve Austin's show. If he's watching, Steve, I issued the challenge 2 months ago at the Red Union launch. You still haven't got me on to be held to account for this terrible thing. But failing that, because I'm always about, well, if you can't get that, what would you do? Demand reform via legislative change to ensure balance, openness and transparency. Well, that's probably in there now, isn't it? Legislate that social media companies cannot exclude community members on the basis of political views, only on the basis of the advocacy of violence or criminal activity. And for those of you, by the way, a little note, for those of you across these things, it's interesting to note that Elon Musk has up till now bought 9.2% of Twitter. Thank you, Elon. They must be very scared there in Twitter Central this evening. And finally, ensure that our universities fully support free speech and research. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone on a bit of a journey tonight. I've tried to talk about the party that I was involved with since 1975, that tumultuous, incredible year in Australian politics, where as a 12-year-old I first got interested in these things, and I think painted a picture hopefully for you about why I made the move that I made and why so many others are. Because the Liberal Party today, I'm afraid, isn't where the true Liberals are. The checklist of matters I've given you are the checklist of just some of the matters that true Liberals should have absolutely no trouble embracing, should be proud, should be prepared to stand up and argue the toss with all those matters. Politicians, though, more importantly, that are prepared to champion these policies can restore faith with older members of the community who are leaving, but also the small business sector, and call me an optimist, but even the young, the aspirational young who want to set up their own startup, and if they're told about these sorts of policies, would get it, because they would see the reward for the risks and effort they're taking to get behind the true Liberals. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, this is an agenda that can excite people, and it can truly unlock the entrepreneurial and creative potential of all Australians, and it takes us to a place where we can have a vision and a positive view of the future, and we're not sort of in the middle of these culture wars in some terrible malaise looking backwards. Thank you, Coops, for having me this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for your interest in what I had to say.
In all seriousness, that was deeply moving, I have to say, and wonderfully true. So thank you so much for that speech tonight. And since we are here, an event about who are, the real Liberals, I have here a little sheet that you slipped me before, which is from the Liberal Party website, and it's entitled Our Beliefs. And I want to just run a couple of them by you, and you can tell me whether they're actually adhering to them. The first is, we believe in the inalienable rights and freedoms of all peoples. And we work towards a lean government that minimises interference in our daily lives and maximises individual and private sector initiative. It also says we believe in the most basic freedoms of parliamentary democracy, the freedom of thought, worship, all those closed churches wouldn't really agree with that, speech, and association. We all remember the border closures and the social distancing. And then finally, in short, we simply believe in individual freedom and free enterprise, and if you share this belief, then ours is the party for you. Campbell, How can they have this on the website with a straight face?
I'm afraid that's the problem, and it's just totally pervasive. It's like the last 2 years, you know, we had at the federal level, we had a PM who allowed all these things to go on in different states, who never called out premiers. I don't know if you've seen the news tonight, you know, for all his sort of, I guess, tacit support for Daniel Andrews, it gets rewarded during election campaign with, you know, Andrews coming out all guns blazing today. David Crisafulli at the, in his role, you know, has tinkered around the edges, and Deb Frecklington never took a stand. And I honestly believe that if we'd had a state LNP opposition that had been prepared to demonstrate to Queenslanders the illogical nature of restrictions, their arbitrary nature, the brutality of them, the breach, you know, the breaches of human rights, stuff consistent with that, I believe that, you know, Palaszczuk would have had to curb a lot of the excesses of the response, and, you know, and they would have been doing their job. And I just don't get why they won't do these things. So I give the Liberal Party today, the LNP's got similar stuff up, I give them, you know, basically a 1 out of 10, and that's why many of us are here.
Yeah, I think so. And look, you know, on the subject of the Liberal Party not calling out premiers, they did a lot of doublespeak. Like Scott Morrison, he said, look, I don't support the vaccine mandates. But we all remember in August a couple of years ago where he said, no, we want them to vaccines to be as mandatory as possible. They go, oh, we want as few lockdowns as possible. They bankrolled the lockdowns, didn't they, by not shutting the checkbook in September 2020 to the premiers. I mean, if they'd shut the checkbook, the lockdowns wouldn't have happened.
Well, look, if you're the PM and you believe in small business, and the Premier today announces that the vaccine the exclusion of the unvaccinated from venues ends on the 14th of April. Well, if you're the PM and you really believed in this stuff, surely you would do as I did today, you would call it out. Like, where's the science that it's the 14th? Why not 8 PM in 20 minutes today? That's real leadership, and that's calling out these things. But I think the sad thing is the lack of principle that we're seeing from all the politicians. I mean, this is not just this shouldn't be just about the Liberal Party, it's just, or the LNP. We're not seeing any sort of principles from any of the political figures, the leading figures. So in this campaign, we've got Anthony Albanese, who's just sort of tying himself in knots, and he's doing quite badly, I think, last 2 weeks, because, you know, he clearly has a very strong ideological view of where he wants to go if he's the PM, but he can't say it. He doesn't dare say it. And it's just he's tying himself up in knots. He can't sort of, you know, he can't have an inquiry into Mean Girls, or, you know, have a sacrificial lamb. He's just got to sort of, you know, keep trundling on. It's quite sad where we are with people without firm bedrock principles.
Shame we don't have a, you know, Ron DeSantis equivalent amongst our Australian premiers. But
if we had someone like that in Queensland, if that was the leader of the opposition, he'd be ahead 5 percentage points in the polls in Queensland today. And I don't know why the LNP can't see it. The opportunity, it's there. They can just go out and grab it if they campaign the right way and they take the fight to the Premier the right way. It's there for them.
Exactly. I mean, and what's irritated me so much about the state LNP over the last 2 years, they seem to have no teeth. You have people like, say, in Victoria, Daniel Andrews putting forward the most insane policies that are so destructive. The stupid Queensland border closure from Palaszczuk, which was so dumb, and they all just sat around and went, oh yes, well, we're going to support that because the focus group polling are telling us that that's popular and we don't want to get, you know, where are the teeth? Where's the teeth of the Liberal Party?
Well, that's it. They're relying on polling can tell you obviously very important things, but there's also the ability to actually shape the conversation and present an argument. And I'll give you an example. hope this sort of works for you, but in the 2012 election campaign, Bligh and Labor were pounding me, day after day about questions about Newman's integrity, etc., etc. By the way, I've never been to the CCC to be interviewed, okay? And I'm sure there's plenty of Labor figures who have, but they just pounded and pounded, and I can tell you now the polling was showing it was working. For those of you who think you shouldn't run negative campaigns, I'm sorry, you have to run negative campaigns, and the LNP should have run a negative campaign when I was Premier in 2015, but that's another story. But anyway, they were pounding away, and the needle's moving their way, and we're going down, and my credibility is going down. And then there was one courageous journalist who dared to keep pressing Anna Bligh, and Bligh finally said, well, look, I don't have anything, but I've got these questions. And it was like, it's like a rubber band stretched to the max had broken or snapped, or the pendulum anyway just swung the other way. And what I'm saying is it's not quite the same thing, but it is the same thing in that well-placed words or argument can be profoundly important in changing public perspectives. And for Crisafulli, for example, to actually demonstrate that people of limited means, of people of modest means, were being forced to live in their cars at the Murwillumbah showgrounds or in their caravans simply because they weren't of sufficient financial capacity about to fly back into Queensland. If they had the money and they'd flown and they could have come home, otherwise they were just restricted for months. I mean, that just, the brutality of that, or some of the cases about newborn infants being separated from parents, all those things were grist to the mill, and an opposition willing to have a go could have changed the whole psyche or the perspective of the community.
Yeah, and that is my great frustration. I'm sure all of you share that frustration. Now look, on the subject of glass half full, you said you're a glass half full person. You mentioned during your speech that 27% of, 25 to 34-year-olds vote for the LNP. That's actually higher than I expected. That's actually higher than I expected from my age group. So what I'm thinking is there an opportunity here? You think those millennials hitting sort of mid-30s, they're getting married, they're having kids, as you said, maybe they're wanting to start business. Perhaps the millennials, if we're thinking glass half full, at that age, are they kind of ripe for the picking when it comes to conservatism and libertarianism? And look, considering they're at that phase of life, how do you appeal to them? How do you cut through all the left-wing noise?
Well, I like the Lib Dems, and particularly because of the libertarian philosophy, which probably way too late in life I woke up to. Maybe this is where I should have been. And some of my supporters don't like it when I talk about it quite this way, but it's like I like the fiscal conservatism over here, but I am quite socially progressive, and those who've been to, was it CPAC or was it when I did the drug thing? It was CPAC. I think there are a few people at CPAC who are sort of horrified, and Lisa certainly is with some of my views on the war on drugs. So the point is, I think the libertarian philosophy is one that is far more saleable to the young, because it's essentially about don't tell me how to live my life, as long as I'm not affecting other people. I think that's got resonance, and I think it deals with I think the young would see, say, the leader of the opposition or a premier rabbiting on about being tough on drugs. There's hypocrisy. I hope that makes sense. So I think a particular pitch, though, is, and this is where I was coming through in my address, Australia doesn't have to have 2.6% growth for the next 20 years. We don't have to. What I'm saying is we create an environment where it's the easiest place in the world to set up a business, that there are people who will actually help you to do it, that the whole system's designed to incentivise you to do it, to actually make you think about, well, what could you be doing? What's that app you want to create, or the business that you want to deliver, or the service you could be delivering? And if you start talking like that and say, well, we're the people that, we're the political party, whoever you are, that is actually going to put in place those measures to allow that to happen, that's got a real X factor for, I think, the young. I mean, the people who come to things like Brisbane Angels and to Steve's organisation. They're from their mid-20s to mid-30s typically, I think, and they've got great ideas. And they could be on board with a libertarian sort of view of the world. And, we ultimately will be a better country. A few years ago, this is a long answer, I went to Israel on a trade mission with Wyatt Roy when he was still in Parliament. So it was an Australian-Israel Chamber of Commerce thing, and it was fantastic. So we went to Jerusalem, went to Tel Aviv, went to Haifa. We visited all these startup companies and incubators and VCs, and we saw what they were doing. And the most profound comment that was made in one of the places we went was this guy who was running a VC stood up and said 30 years ago, all the mums in this country wanted, their young son or daughter to be a top lawyer or a top surgeon. Now they want them to be a startup entrepreneur. In less than 30 years, they changed the mindset, the culture, and Israel is just pumping out stuff that you just wouldn't believe. And they're a small, dynamic nation that has to fight every day to survive. Contrast that with a country that just puts stuff on ships and puts it overseas and has large corporates that just sort of sit, or large corporate bureaucrats who think that's business. And, that, I hope I've inspired you anyway. That's what I think is there for the young, because that's an opportunity for them to just zip ahead of people and generate wealth and prosperity for themselves and their families.
Well, look, I think we have a little bit of time for a bit of a Q&A from the audience. We have Barclay.
On the topic of the federal Liberals not really intervening with state policies and, the vaccine mandates and whatnot, I kind of find myself between two thoughts. Like, I like the idea of states' rights, but I also hate vaccination mandates, and I wish the federal Liberals stood in. So how do you reconcile those two things of hopefully being a supporter of state rights, but also not being in favour of vaccination mandates, and ensuring that the Liberals actually toughened up?
Well, okay, I gave a long answer on the last one. I'll try and make this one shorter so I have more opportunities for people to ask questions. But it hits like this. I'm a big one for states' rights, always was, always have been, and I like the idea of competitive federalism. But the idea that look, I'm not a lawyer, but the spirit of the Federation and the Constitution, which says free trade, has to happen between the states. That's a starting point for me. And for the feds to allow the states to then have all these different rules that made it impossible to actually properly run businesses across state lines, that should have been called out. In terms of the vaccine sort of mandate, the vaccine coercion, my position has been quite simple. If the vaccine was like a traditional vaccine, which meant if I had the shot, I couldn't transmit to someone else, and by getting a high level of vaccination, then you actually really did protect everybody, I could understand an argument then to actually say, well, we're going to lean on people a bit. But that's not the case here. It doesn't do that at all. People still can transmit. I know an army of people have had the shot and have all got it. And so there is no argument for that. There's no logic to it. If you're vaccinated, that's the best protection for you. I don't care if the whole room, by the way, is unvaccinated this evening. I'm vaccinated. I've had my best attempt at a level of protection. I don't care at all. I just don't care 2 hoots. And I don't get why that couldn't be the position of government. And I again don't know why the Prime Minister's been writing letters to his own constituents, which I've seen, which says it won't be compulsory, but then just sits back and waves it on. I can't cop that.
So, at what point does an entity become big enough to intervene as opposed to just saying that's a part of the corporation? Develop as opposed to a play one. Traditionally a libertarian would say that if you own something, say for example in your own house, you're allowed to set the rules as to just what people say inside.
Yep.
Otherwise they have to So how do you reconcile?
I think that's a really good question. So you're talking about the rights of the corporation and the founders and the shareholders to run it the way they want it because it's their possession, versus what I'm advocating, which is that people should be able to basically conduct themselves in the way that I outlined, as long as it's not violent, etc. So the answer is about monopolies, and I think these large social media companies are now the public square, and there's very few of them, and it's very hard for anyone to really get up and provide a platform that competes with them. That's the problem. So I take a philosophical point of view that they're monopolies that can and should be regulated for the overall good of society. It's not something, it's not something I do or an approach I come to just, easily, but that's where I am on it. And so I think that what we're seeing is they are themselves using their monopoly position in many cases now to be quite politically active against, it tends to be against people from the conservative right. Yeah, so that's how I reconcile those.
How can we encourage young people to be Liberal Democrats if lots of young people have their God as climate change?
Good question.
That's a great question, and those sharp eyes this evening in my ears in my speech noticed there was only really a quick reference to climate change, because I could have written the whole thing about that, so I actually purposely took it out. Look, I think the only way we deal with. Now let me start again. The problem we've got is we've had 30 years of relentless brainwashing, okay? And that's where we are now, and hence the capitulation of the Liberal National Party with net zero. But I think it requires people still. I'm not saying it's lost. I'm saying we need people, and that's why I'm putting my hand up for this race. And I hope my colleagues will always be prepared to do that if they get elected as well. But you need people to stand up and push back all the time. So someone whose name came up earlier on, Matt Canavan, he's someone who's prepared to do it in the LNP. One of the few, he's a trooper, and that's great. We need people like that are the ones we need on the Conservative side. We need to be pushing back all the time. And I do it all the time when I am on Sky. I'll continue to do so, and the way I always tell the story is 15 years ago I believed, I drank the Kool-Aid. Unlike most people, I've gone the other way because the things that I was told 15 years ago haven't happened. And I've got to get this in. Sorry, this is almost a random thought. I need you to take this home with you. So, we've been hearing so much about unprecedented this, unprecedented that, and then the PM 2 weeks ago said, Australia's getting harder to live in because of floods. Well, here's the thing. There's 200 years of history of Brisbane, of white history, in the 200 years. In the first 100 years of Brisbane's history, there were 9 floods as big as 2022 or larger. In the next 100 years, guess how many there's been so far? 3. Okay? So sadly, we're overdue for more. I don't want to depress you if you live on the river, okay? Okay? But we have a plan. The Lib Dems have a plan for flood mitigation. But anyway, sorry, that's a blatant, shameless plug. Sorry. Look, anyway, it's just fight. We've got to fight. We mustn't give up the fight because it is nonsense, and bad policy is now being implemented. I've got to say this as well. So surely, in a country with such well-educated people, the penny would have dropped in the last 4 weeks that the world's changed, that energy security is what it's all about, and that people who go totally green and stop using their brown coal or nuclear reactors like the Germans get their head handed to them on a plate, as Putin has done. That's what's happened. Does Australia want to do that? I don't think so.
Thanks for small businesses and our entrepreneurs? And do you think there's definitely some room for like the foreign investment laws and getting some of that foreign investment to Australian entrepreneurs?
Look, I think you make an incredibly important point, and I say that as someone up front. I say I run a commercial property fund, okay? So, you know, we are dealing with the insatiable Australian desire to put money into bricks and mortar, albeit commercial. And I think it's a huge sort of misalignment of the country's objectives, and it's because of the way that I suppose the tax system is set up. And some of the things I was talking about during the speech were about dealing with that, and what I've said afterwards about my little spiel a few minutes ago about let's create an environment where this is the best place in the world for start-up businesses. Remember what I said about the director's veil? That's critically important. I mean, we have these gooses in our parliament and our state parliaments, federal and state parliament, who go, we want you to start a business. Go and create, do this, don't that. Don't hurt anyone, we'll put you in jail. You know, like, it's so inconsistent. This whole thing needs to be looked at. So I think the tax law as well, the reason I raised the issue about start-up companies being able to grant shares free of charge is Malcolm Turnbull, I know that might be a heresy to mention his name at CPAC, but just bear with me for a sec. Please. Malcolm was on the right direction, but he really, I think, got outmanoeuvred by the ATO and other bureaucrats. And the thing is, if we said to start-up companies who couldn't afford to pay for talent, or, for example, grey hair on their boards, you can pay people in shares, they will not be taxed, you can pay as much as you like. You can pay as much as you like in shares. They will be taxed on the day they're actually sold. And then they become basically capital gains taxable. That would just be so simple, so straightforward. And I don't know why we don't do it. And that would actually really incentivise people and give them the support they need to run those new start-up businesses. It would be a huge game changer.
Now, my question is related to welfare. Now, I volunteer at a meal on wheels, and one of the couples that volunteers there, they're rather well off, and I recently found out that although they own multiple investment properties and drive fancy cars, they're actually on Centrelink. So my question is, if we have rather well-off people, rorting the system, how do we stop people who are poorer and not as fortunate from, letting go of the government's teach and moving forward?
Well, I think the big thing is that we've got to try and start with a cultural shift back to where Australia was. I mean, I'm not suggesting what I'm about to say was a happier or nicer place, but 50 or 60 years ago, people wouldn't go onto unemployment benefits because that was the dole and it was a shameful thing. Now that's rough. People, I think, in a fair and just society, people should have that social support. But we've come a long way to where we are now, where during the first few months of the pandemic, when the coalition handed out huge cheques to young people who'd only worked a few hours each week, and they got $750 cheques and thought, whoopee, this is better than working. So that's the other extreme. I think we have to have a recalibration of our welfare system that it is absolutely targeted at those that deserve it. But hand in glove with that is this thing that I mentioned, which is cutting the tax rate. Stop this thing where we tax people at fairly high levels, marginal tax. People, middle Australia's taxed quite high. It really is. Drop those tax rates, but give the people their money and then have a message of, self-reliance and stop telling people that the government is going to sort everything out for you. Because we are on the road to perdition, we really are. And you only have to look at what happens when, we had the floods in northern New South Wales, and then people are hooking into the army because they're not there quickly enough to clean out their homes. like that says a lot. That sort of, hopefully it was small minority, but it says a lot about the psyche that they just expect the army to come and clean out their homes.
I think we might sadly be out of time. Campbell Newman, thank you
I've talked enough.
so much.
Thanks, Daisy.
Thank you so much for being here.
I'd also like to thank Daisy Cousins. Daisy is I would call her a conservative warrior. I think that's an apt description for Daisy. She and her husband Callum. If you don't know Callum Thwaites is one of the apart from Daisy's husband, which in its own right should make him famous. But Callum was famously and tragically the recipient of the government's most dangerous whip, and that was, or lash, and that was at the hands of Gillian Triggs and the Human Rights Commission. And the Human Rights Commission acts as a stain upon conservative Australia, and I know that Callum and 5 other students suffered greatly from the overbearing inquisition of the Human Rights Commission. And sadly, even though the head of the Human Rights Commission has been changed, the legislation and the powers that vested in those that came down on top of Callum's head are still there, and they will still be there when inevitably the government changes and the Human Rights Commission head gets replaced. And this is the challenge to us, this is the challenge for us as classical liberals, as those that believe that sovereignty is vested in the individual, those believe what Campbell is saying, and quite frankly what others are saying, like Matt Canavan and Amanda Stoker and others. This is the challenge for us. How do we galvanise this? How do we change the politics of the day? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that I'm really pleased that you're here. I think this is a great start. It's always a great thing to see people turn up at an event like this. My daughter was at the door. I hope she didn't. She's 14. I tell you what, I hope everyone brings their kids to these sort of events. I really do think we've all been talking about the education, what we can do. You know what? Just bring them along. And now we've got CPAC at Luna Park in Sydney on October 1st and 2nd this year. Nigel Farage should come back for a victory lap. We've got Americans coming. This is going to be one hell of an event. There's going to be close to 2,000 people there every day. Now, we're going to make it essentially free to bring your kids. Look, I just want to thank you for coming. CPAC is a volunteer organisation. We're literally run by volunteers. No one's making $1. No one wants to make $1. But we do want to make a difference. If you want to make a difference, jump onto the website, join up, chip in, help us make a difference. Help us return this country to those traditional liberal values that this country was built on and should return to. And when it does, we'll regain our confidence. We won't be so stressed about things, because you know what? We'll know once again what we believe in, and the world will be our oyster. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Campbell Newman. Thank you, Daisy Cousins. And thank you